Well, welcome back to the show today, folks. Our guest today is Stephen Presley. Dr. Presley is an author. He's known for his work in historical theology and biblical interpretation. Stephen holds PhD from the University of St. Andrews. It gets more impressive. He focuses his research on the intersection between historical theology and the Christian spiritual life, particularly focusing in on the early church's approach to cultural engagement. Stephen is also an associate professor of church history at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. And Stephen is also a senior fellow for religion and public life at the CRCD, and that is the Center for Religion, Culture, and Democracy. He leads initiatives that aim to offer a positive vision of religion for the public square. So, Stephen, well, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. It's so good to be with you. Appreciate it.
Yes, glad to have you. Before we get into the book, maybe just briefly, just tell me a little bit. I was intrigued by exactly what do you do at the CRCD?
Yeah, for around the last 15 years or so, I've been a seminary professor and been working with pastors at a couple different Baptist seminaries and been really involved in training pastors. But this will tie into the book. As I began writing this book, just looking at how the early church engaged that pagan world around them. It got me sort of engaged with an organization that does some of that today. So the Center for Religion, Culture, and Democracy works with particularly college students, juniors and seniors, who are heading out and going into either law or humanities or trying to go to graduate programs, just really people of faith that are trying to make a difference in the world. And so we have a number of different programs for those students, typically academically gifted or intellectually gifted, often students really, college students eager to change the world and make a difference.
Right.
And we
Whip
bring
the
them
world.
together. Yeah, we bring them together and we talk about Christian worldview and we talk about how to be a person of faith in the public square, in politics, or in whatever field they find themselves. And so that's the work I often do with the center. And in addition, continue to teach some classes at the seminary work with pastors as well.
Awesome, yeah. Pastors need help.
They
I try to work with them myself.
Man, the
So
times are changing fast, as you know, and so pastors are in need today of a lot of these good conversations.
Yes, they are. Yeah. So what brought about this book? Why this book? What was this just in your spirit? Was this like a lecture series you're doing at seminary or preaching series?
Well, this might have come up, but to really sort of, it's a little bit of a Monday morning quarterback situation where I look back at some of my interests. And when I went to seminary, I went feeling God's call in my life to go into ministry. But, it was at a time, particularly the mid 2000s, when I was feeling some of the reverberations of cultural change going on. And I can remember taking a church history class in seminary. We started with, the apostolic period, and we started talking about some of the earliest centuries of the church. And I just realized quickly there are some doctrinal and theological claims and even moral claims that are early on that just resonated with me and demonstrated that the truth of Christianity is not something that is new. It's something that is old. And I kind of became interested in some of those early centuries of the church, particularly before the rise of Constantine in the 4th century, when the church is really a minority group and the church is trying to make their way in the world. And I just became interested in those, and I've been writing about them. And then as I'm raising a family in this world, and I'm realizing that some of the apologetic and evangelistic and strategies and postures of those early fathers, you already see many of them in the book of Acts already resonated with me. And so some of the motivation, is to provide pastors and Christian leaders and Christians just, hey, look, the church was engaged, and writing some of it resonated with me too.
So the title of the book is Cultural Sanctification. Maybe just break that down for what does that mean?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things you see already in the book of Acts, it doesn't take you long to realize as you're marching your way through the book of Acts that the church is not exactly the most popular group of people, around. That the church is being challenged, and those same kind of postures continue. And it was in the early church before the rise, again, before the rise of Constantine. The church is living in a culture in which the fabric of the culture is really your pagan gods. You think about Paul on Mars Hill in Acts 17, and the
Yeah.
kind of encounter Paul on Mars Hill is really the kinds of encounters that those early church writers and thinkers are having. And I realize as I look around in our world today, Western Christianity is itself fragmenting and being purged from institutions in ways that were reminiscent of that early Christian world. And so what I really do, I think sanctification as a way of life is something we Christians have to recover. What does it mean to live the spiritual life in the public square? What does that look like? And so that's the sanctification. Cultural sanctification is in exhorting Christians to live holy lives within the fabric of a culture that is often set against them. And I think that's a pattern and a pathway to see transformation or see cultural renewal.
And then when these Christians, you talk about engaging the world like the early church, they had quite the different perspective. It wasn't quite, I'm going to walk down the aisles, I'm going to shake Stephen's hand, I'm going to sign a card. In 5 minutes, I'm a member of the church.
You're right. It's a different world. I even make argument. Some of that kind of revivalism was often predicated upon a Christendom. And I think that's going to be a challenge. I'm not saying in every case we can't see revival. I pray for revival. I pray for God to move. But in a pagan world, it often took people, conversion was a longer process. There are, of course, moments and instantaneous, but one comparison you see in the early church, I talk about this a little bit in the book, but more in some things I've written afterwards, is the comparison of the Ethiopian eunuch to Paul on Mars Hill. What was the Ethiopian eunuch doing? The Ethiopian eunuch was reading Isaiah 53. There's like a pre-discipleship that has already gone on. He's already been seeking. He's already been active.
Yeah.
He's asking. I mean, how many of us long for
help me out here?
Yep. But what happens on Mars Hill? Paul goes on, he's surrounded by the philosophers. And Paul begins at ground zero. I mean, he begins, how many gods are there?
Yeah.
These are not gods, this is wood, hay, and stubble. And then he begins with the doctrine of God and he walks down. And that's the realization is the shaping and discipleship suddenly becomes an imperative in a postmodern culture. And that's what I see going on in the early church, this just a longer period of evangelism, apologetics, discipleship, and ready for for it to take a while to demonstrate the goodness of the church, the way in which the church is essential for the flourishing of the world.
Yeah, they weren't trying to boost their roster up. When you ask a pastor, how many members do I have in my church? He said, well, 5,000. Well, let's drill down. Let's drill down a little bit on that, Stephen. You got 5? How many are there Sunday morning? 800? You got 800 in your church. But so they were really interested in, because there was a cost. Nowadays, we might not, right now, there's probably not the cost. We're not going to be probably martyred like Polycarp or Blandina that you mentioned in the book. But it was a serious undertaking because your whole life was going to be turned upside down.
Yeah.
I'm going to the temple one week, the next week I'm not. I'm going to worship the pagan gods. I'm going to the gladiatorial games. So I know you talk a lot about catechesis and liturgy. So break that down for us about really maybe what is catechesis and the liturgy, that they would begin to maybe a Romans 12 type deal, renew their minds and ground them in this type faith. So when the trials did come, hopefully that they would be able to endure to the end.
Yeah, I mean, I know probably a lot of your listeners experience this, but as Christianity, as the Western culture has changed and Christianity is becoming less of a presence or of a religious orientation that is bounding Western civilization, it becomes harder for Christians to live. I mean, you're just faced with moral choices in your jobs, in your businesses. You're faced with moral decisions and moral choices, who to hire. in your families. You're as children grow up and maybe make choices that aren't driven by a Christian worldview, you're suddenly faced with challenges and choices, and it's not unlike what the early church experienced. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of discussion about martyrdom and persecution in the early church. And as you walk through the centuries, persecution becomes more empire wide and that sort of thing. But from the very beginning, there's a whole posture of skepticism. I mean, you see it again in the book of Acts. I mean, there is a questioning and a skepticism that you can see already. You have to maintain what, in the book, I talk about the virtue of fortitude and courage and those sorts of things. And there has to be a connection between your faith and your life, the life that you live. And the early church put a premium on discipleship, in part because, as I talked briefly about the book about catechesis, you have to take on a Christian view of the world. And that just took time. And then you have to connect what you believe to the way you live. And the church's worship and the regular gathering of the community of faith and the spiritual life were all connected kind of in a package. Like, don't neglect the gathering. Join, come, because you're formed when you come to worship. The early church understood that synergy between discipleship, worship, and then the spiritual life that is embedded, and realized that every decision they made had moral connections and moral consequences. And so, I feel we have a crisis of the spiritual life as we move outside of Christendom. And Christians are now having to face the reality of the connection between their worldview and their embedded religious posture, religious choices, or Christian choices that they're making. So yeah, that's why I think catechesis and liturgy and the spiritual life are all kind of woven together.
I think a lot of the research that we see that comes out of different organizations with our high school students, and the numbers, so maybe they've gone to church, their whole life, and they go off to university. Yeah, I was talking to a youth minister. I think the number now, when he started, I think it was like 72%. He's telling me now it's upward about 90 that just walk away from the faith.
Yeah.
And, I think that maybe you disagree with me, but part of that probably is the lack of catechesis, discipleship, really getting in the Word, getting them grounded for, what they're going to face once they step off into some hostile territory. It's pagan. Sugarcoat it all you want to, but a lot of these professors now just would intimidate you if you claim to have Christian faith.
Yeah. And, the one thing that we're now seeing, like the one thing that is becoming clear, you read a book like, I don't mention it in my book, but there's a book called Mission Drift. And a book, Mission Drift, it's a few years old, but it walks through institutions that historically were founded with a Christian mission. So just a classic example of course, your Ivy League schools. Well, then there's a whole host of other schools, but then it also walks you through things like the YMCA and others that have publicly various organizations, nonprofits that have publicly rejected sort of any connection to the Christian faith. A book like that sort of walks you through historically these things that were, now aren't. And the thing about it is, a lot of faculty at our institutions of higher education are no longer even any semblance of a connection to a Christian view of the world, and adamantly opposed to it at times. And the institutions are bearing that mark, and we're sending students to institutions to be formed when the institution itself is set against Christianity and set against the faith. And the only answer, it seems, is to build deep roots for these students that can navigate those kind of treacherous waters that lay before them.
Yeah, I'm reminded of the scripture also, what can the righteous do when the foundations are destroyed? And as you talk about in your book, all these different institutions, they're Christian in name only. They have departed from the faith, and even churches, that even takes it a step further, I guess, where a lot of the evangelical churches that you and I grew up with, the mainline denominations now, they are teaching people things that are not biblical. And so you even have to address those. We're really getting back to Mars Hill. They're getting beliefs thrown at them from, quote, ministers. And so
And I think that's a
There's
challenge. One of the curious your thoughts on this. I think that's what one of the differences between the early church and today is we are living in the shadow of a crumbling, sort of changing and evolving institutions. The early church had an advantage of starting as a small group,
yeah,
and there's a book, I mentioned it in my introduction, called Nonverts, that looks at the rise of the nuns, but calculates what percentage of those nuns used to be active churchgoers.
yeah, yeah.
And it's upwards of 70% of those who identify as nuns used to go to church. So now all of our pastors are ministering among people who have their identity is I left that. And man, it becomes a challenge when your pastors. I'm sure you've seen this challenge with as you've worked with pastors over the last few years.
Yeah, oh, for sure. Yes. And yeah, well, we could talk about that for a long time. There's really you have really two different, I guess, maybe extremes. You have those who let's just isolate, we're going to form a compound over here. We're going to go up to the mountains, live in the monasteries. And then you have the other fringe that's going to be more of a confrontational approach. But you kind of take more of a middle ground, and I think the word is it embedded? Is that the phrase you use over and over again? I think.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, because the reality, yeah, there's multiple books, and the challenge we really face, and I hope this resonates with your pastors. I know I've trained and I've been a pastor and I've worked with pastors, and there are times when, depending on where you live geographically, that you need to not participate in certain social institutions. And you use the example of the gladiatorial games or worshiping at a pagan altar. I mean, there are plenty of times that Christians ought not participate in certain, social or civic things or activities because of so right at the heart of this, there's debates about education, where to send my kids to school, all those kinds of things. And certainly pastors and parents need to pray and think about those challenges. The problem is all of us, and this was the early church too, you have to work in the world. You have to be you have to contribute. And as a pastor, I mean, you're filled with a congregation who is already embedded in the world. And you're constantly trying to navigate that. And I try to provide a framework for starting to think about the challenges of shepherding a flock that is both and living both embedded in the world, working. Your kids are in sports or, they're doing things in the world, and yet try to remain driven by your Christian worldview, while at the name not seeing the only answer being political power, or if I can just change who's in certain positions, everything will be fine. Well, those positions are important, and I'm glad when that happens, but you're always walking with that tension. And so I try to provide a vision for pastors that focuses on, how do I live that embedded life? How do I live the mundane and the everyday life, being faithful in my local context where the Lord has placed me?
So what are some of the things that the early church did? I mean, they went from being persecuted, hunted down, all that within a couple of centuries or so. They're dominating. They're Constantinople, and so they obviously were doing something right that you hit on in the book here.
They're doing, yeah, and they absolutely. I mean, that's one of the fascinating things that it's one of the historical facts that you just can't get around.
No, that's powerful.
Yeah,
Powerful.
the fact that you just had Jesus and this group of guys, he gathered around him, and then they're discipling, and they're planting churches, and they're on missionary journeys, and eventually, and by no means were they perfect. I mean, I talk about in the book, there are plenty of times that in some of the martyrdom accounts, for example, there are Christians who defected, and the church is anguished over that. And they're not perfect, but I like the way Rodney Stark is a sociologist who wrote the book called The Rise of Christianity. And he looks at sort of all kind of the factors, and he paints this it's a great book, kind of paints all the environmental and social and cultural factors. But then in the conclusion, he basically says, this is what he says: what ultimately made the difference was Christian doctrine and Christian morality taking on flesh in people's lives, people living according to the convictions of Christian doctrine and Christian morality. That is what ultimately won the day and made the difference.
I thought you were going to
Important
say, we need more smoke machines and big screen TVs and a preacher in skinny jeans, but okay.
I mean, I don't know exactly how their dress code played out back in the second and third centuries, but on to that point, I mean, sometimes we think if we can just change the forms and not the substance, that everything will be right. And the early church presses us, yeah. If you slap on skinny jeans and slap on smoke machines, but don't have the true Christian faith and the true Christian gospel, right?
Yeah, and you're producing something that's, they're going to become like us, whatever we're doing. If you're
Yeah.
discipling them in that direction, that's
Yeah.
what they're going to turn out to be.
And the reality is in catechesis, I talk about this in my chapter on discipleship and catechesis. You've got to catechize both in doctrine and in morality. That's the one challenge that we have. It's like, for example, a Christian view of marriage. I mean, historically, you didn't necessarily, I mean, it was good to you taught on marriage, but now,
what is a marriage?
what, like, and then on top of that, how does a pastor now help their congregation or help Christians think through a whole million scenarios now that are unfolding before us in our relationship to what the state has deemed a new visions of marriage, plural, new different types of marriage. And so, the early church were, I have a whole section on the church's sexual ethic and how important it was. There's a book I mentioned in there, From Shame to Sin, and he talks about how the church was advocating for a vision of marriage, a vision of life that ran so counter to the pagan vision that was embedded in the Roman world. And that too is like an example of what Rodney Stark, I think, is saying.
Yeah, just some of the things that the Christians were accused of. So cannibalism, I think, hit the top of the list there. These love feasts, there was some incest going on, some immorality, no telling what went on these love feasts, Use your imagination, but they were accused of being atheist. So they're really just on this outside, this, I think Ninja Gupta, his book, Strange Religion, they would have had to have looked at these people. Oh, you worship a God who died. He was a couple of criminals he was crucified. Come on, Stephen, can't be a God. And this resurrection, what? Help me here. You really lost me now.
Well, it's funny to look through. In fact, one of the earliest Christian texts that just totally mocks the church and all of it is by a pagan named Celsus. And I mentioned him a bit in the book.
Good.
And you can get a copy. I mean, go on Amazon, you can buy. I've used it in classes and in other settings, and it's funny to read through it because you feel like you could read through the exact same criticisms today. And all of those things, like Christians are weird, Christians are cannibals, they're incestuous, they're all those sort of cultural tropes that tries to portray the church in all kinds of crazy ways. But it is funny to read. It is so funny to read Celsus. He has some bits in there where it's so funny. He's complaining because the Christians are caring for the children. Like there's Christians who are out trying to teach the children the gospel, and he's just totally flabbergasted that they would even care. He talks about the makeup of the church that is comprised of wool workers and cobblers and just like your everyday people. And the church is drawing these people in because they have a vision of life that is just better than what the Roman world has to offer. And so it is funny to read. It's hilarious to read Celsus because the things we're facing are often recycled and just newer versions of some of the same things that the early church was experiencing. Resurrection is a really interesting one. If you look at the end of I close with that allusion to Blandina that you mentioned. And she's in the Martyrs of Lyon and Vienne, one of those. I've been to that amphitheater there.
She would be in the extended version of Hebrews 11.
She would. She would. That's exactly right. She is, it talks about, those who have been martyred.
Well, share that story of Blandina, because that was kind of new to me. I was a little bit familiar with Polycarp, but
Oh,
I think
yeah,
people might be interested to hear that and what she went through, and because they were worried
yeah,
about her.
they were. And that letter, Eusebius is a fourth century church father that writes the first church history. It is a 10-volume account that walks through from the times of the apostles to the fourth century. Eusebius was writing at that time, and he records a letter. He has lots of stuff in there, but it's one little section where he records a letter. The letter is written from Christians who are in Lyon. Modern day, you can go to modern day Lyon, and he's delivering the letter down to Rome. Irenaeus, the bishop who became the bishop of Lyon after that, was delivering the letter, and it was written to churches in Asia Minor, some of the churches you like mentioned in the book of Revelation, for example. But it gives you accounts of when these Gaelic tribes and Roman authorities sort of conspired to kill the Christians, and it just gives accounts of all of these Christians that were martyred, including the bishop who's 90 years old and several other people in the church. But the last one alive was this woman, Blandina. And it is so powerful. You read everything I've stood with my family on the edge of that amphitheater when we read that account. When I was in my doctoral program, got a chance to go to France, and you can go there today, and there's a little amphitheater with a pillar there. I've been told since they put in a small museum commemorating these things, and it walks you through the tortures. I mean, it's just brutal. And I mean, by the time you get to the end of it, you're really sort of motivated, which is why they wrote it. This is why you're supposed to be motivated towards fortitude and courage.
Yeah.
And how she died is she's tortured in all kinds of brutal ways, but finally she's cast in a net, and a bull kind of takes her life. But the text calls her like a noble mother. She remained faithful to the end. She proclaimed, "I am a Christian," and that has brought her rest and encouragement. And yeah, the community was concerned. They were concerned about her, especially, that she was going to make a faithful testimony, and she did. And it quotes the passage, "The weak things of the world shame the wise." And here you have this young woman who shames these Roman soldiers they're just torturing her. But the end of that letter, it actually says they burned all the bodies and they threw their ashes in the river, so that they did not get to have the hope of resurrection, but the community still had the hope. I mean, but it shows you the extent they went to suppress their hope in what God was going to do in their lives.
Well, it's like the soldiers that came to get Polycarp.
Mm-hmm.
He's sitting there. He said, "Hey guys, let's have a little meal here. I need some prayer time before y'all take me out." And so on the way back, they're trying to tell him, "Hey man, just chill, brother. Do your incense thing, take a knee, whatever, and you'll be all right." Because he said there, he feeds them. They listen to him pray, as you say, and yeah, what a testimony that would have been to that.
Yeah, I was just going to say the challenge is, as a leader, for Christian leaders, one of the things the early church struggled with, I don't think I mentioned this in the book, but one of the things the church struggled with, do you send your leaders away during persecution? Because without good Christian leaders, who's going to lead the community?
Yeah.
And so in that Polycarp account, he goes to the outskirts of the city, and he's, as you talked about, he's anguished. But he decides, the Lord says, no, you need to be an example, and that example would motivate. And then you pray new leaders. New leaders will come.
I kind of gave a picture too, as he's addressing the emperor of the proconsul of Romans 13.
It's
the guy's turn the lights out on him, and he's basically telling him, quoting the apostles back, to respect him and so forth, which leads into a whole nother conversation there about political leaders. What are their roles? Our response to them, the laws that they push out.
Mm-hmm. And that's the second chapter I get into, in part because I try to paint a general portrait of what's called a political theology. And so that chapter does a few things. It shows, first and foremost, like you said, it's amazing. I mean, Polycarp is right there standing before a Roman proconsul, and he quotes Romans 13. This guy's about to take his life. And he's like, look, the apostle told me I have to respect you because God put you in power. So I better listen to the apostle. All right. So political power is not a inherently bad thing. And so right now, I mean, we're caught in a modern world in a political tussle
Yeah.
that is challenging us from all sides. And I think what the early church does is demonstrate that political power is a good thing, but they're also not under the assumption that political power is going to solve all our problems.
Yes.
In other words, if I legislate certain things, that's going to make people better. But we know that the law reveals sin. And so one of the challenges I think we have as the church is how both to maintain the importance of citizenship and of being an active citizen embedded in the world, encouraging public officials to make wise decisions, yet at the same time realizing that God doesn't use the state to transform people's lives. The gospel and the Spirit of God works to transform people's lives. And the early church is struggling with that in a pagan world as they're thinking about these things.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that's most recent with us right now, and I'm sure with your ministry, you saw this very clear, is it seemed like pastors couldn't win for losing on this COVID lockdown situation. And whew, you had some people like, okay, we're not shutting down. I don't care what they say. We're showing up. We're doing this in person. Forget this online stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And then you had the whole other extreme from both ends of the spectrum there. That was such a hard time. And, they felt like, well, if we shut down, we're caving, we're giving in to the government and we're healthy and we're responsible. And God tells us to meet together, don't forsake the assembling of yourself and on. And so how did you see all that? We have hindsight now, of course, and a lot of the things that we see now were not as clear, definitely not as clear. And, I think probably mistakes were made on both sides, but
there's a recent book by James Davidson Hunter called Democracy and Solidarity. And the big thesis there is that for democracy to function, you really have to have some measure of solidarity. And one of the questions is, what are the things that unite us? And I think there's something similar that happens in the church. You look at how many passages. I mean, I'm thinking about John 17, the high priestly prayer, may they be one as we are one. And one of the themes that I've reflected upon, I don't know if I always emphasize this in the book, but these kinds of conversations and some reflecting even about the COVID issue as well, is how hard it is to maintain a unity in a pagan world, how hard it is for our pastors. Because if it's not COVID, another issue is lurking around the corner, and we're going to have competing visions of how to respond. And so pastors, I have worked with a number of pastors. I pray for the fortitude and the pastoral care, and I pray for the spirit of unity that can work through these things. Realize that we need to remain unified in our convictions about how we face all kinds of social issues. I mean, COVID is such a good example, and I think, like you said, this side of it, we now are wiser.
For
And I
sure.
think that's the one thing that I think some of our working together, we can now make some wise decisions based upon some experience and some unity. But I'm sure you, as you mentioned, with so many pastors, their congregations were divided, and it was a very difficult time and to be leading a church.
Yeah, for sure. So you talk about one of the chapters you have, I really enjoyed that, the intellectual life. There's 5 chapters here, so it's a good read, a quick read, folks. Right here, Cultural Sanctification, Dr. Stephen Presley. Be in the show notes. But you start out the chapter, and I like how you did this with really, I guess, all the chapters. You're a pretty good storyteller, it looks like. But you got these 3 guys, they're just, going out for a stroll, walking down, and a couple of them are Christians, and let's see, Felix, Octavius, and then you got a pagan guy. You got to throw a pagan in there. And so maybe just share that story a little bit, and how it just seems like an everyday occurrence.
Yeah.
How you engage people with the truth of the gospel just every day. The woman at the well, the guy pinching incense, worshiping Seraphis, I believe it was.
Serapis,
Serapis.
That's what's amazing about some of these accounts is they resonate. I think, with our life today so much. But yeah, and these are the stories I had been reading. And as I read them, yeah, in this, you got three guys, two Christians and a pagan. Pagan worships a pagan god, just a simple little gesture. I mean, you can see this like happening in a conversation around the water table,
Yeah,
or on a Zoom call, I guess nowadays. I mean,
sure.
you can see it happening where someone makes a comment or does something, and it's like it immediately sparked a debate. And I call it the apologetic life. And that's the real challenge. When you walk through the book, and I hope you saw this, the challenge of living in a pagan world is you're dealing with multiple fronts. You've got a whole host of issues. You've got the issue of how do I relate to the political authorities and how do I deal with that? You've got the issue of how do I deal with the public intellectuals, the people that are making the arguments in the public square that are swaying the people in my church or my friends or my family or whatnot. And I think that's Minucius Felix's Octavius. I think that was an example of how to have everyday conversations and the kinds of apologetic arguments that they're going to be presenting. They deny the resurrection, they deny the legitimacy of Christ, all kinds of the arguments that you brought up earlier are all brought up, and then he responds. And
Yeah.
it's a template for, I mean, it's like you could be an apologetic training session today. It's like just normal objections that you might run into. And what was helpful about that is, I think, as you said, those kinds of occurrences are going to happen more regularly when you don't live in a Christendom, when you live in a pagan world. You're just life. These things are going to be coming up, and you're having these kinds of conversations. And so that chapter was meant to say, hey, be prepared to sort of engage the intellectual authority of the day.
Yeah, it's interesting to me because I was just reading, I was preparing for another podcast in a couple of days. And the particular ministry, there's a questionnaire. He's doing this, I can't remember, Barna or whoever, but one of the big dogs. And they were asking people, how would you feel most comfortable to share the gospel? 92% of them said, I would like to be able to tell them, here's a video, let me send you this video. And I get God uses medium, and I get all that, Stephen, okay? I get it. But it kind of just was one of those things you read, it just kind of cut me. I thought, here we have a large percentage of people that did not want to, like these two guys, Felix and Octavius, to be able to say, hey, you're my neighbor, I'm embedded here, we work together, wherever you're at. Not be able to feel comfortable and confident enough to share the gospel with them, but they would shoot an email with a video clip of 5 spiritual or whatever steps to Jesus and sign the card.
Yeah. It's an inspiring story because two things are things we've already talked about. You realize the cost that's at stake in the ancient world, and so that should resonate with us. And that's, I think, the purpose of that text was to motivate people to have those kinds of conversations, and just to have the casual. You're walking in the, along a road by a beach. You're hanging out. Let's just have a gospel conversation right now.
Yeah.
Let's just talk. And the confidence of, hey, look, this is important, and I'm unashamed about the conviction of what I believe, and a willingness to kind of engage. Yeah. That's a staggering statistic.
I had to go back and read it again and again just to let it sink in and absorb. And I think I'm going to drill down on him when we get to that. But you mentioned that, like 1 Peter 3:15 says, Scripture, I'm sure you'll always be ready to give an answer to everyone who asks you for the reason for the hope that you have. And as you point out, in the intellectual life, evangelicals, we're not known for our intellectual rigor, as you put, or our brilliance. I think we feel like there's professional Christians, and then we're the sideline. We're not even the B team. We paid these guys. That's what they do, Stephen. You're the man. You go take care of that. It's like 2 classes, I would think, that we don't feel like we have to do it. And in some sense, going back to kind of just what we were talking about, retreating, I think there is just a retreat. Maybe not, we're not going up into the mountains and into a monastery, but I think you can retreat and still be right in the middle of everybody else.
Yeah.
You're just not opening your mouth. You're
Mm.
just, hey, I'm not going to say a thing. I'm going to go along to
Uh-huh.
get along, whatever they're doing. And I've been guilty of it at times, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I can absolutely see that and totally agree that there is a kind of retreat where you're embedded in the institution, or you're embedded in the social world or the cultural world, but you're totally apathetic. And I think like a text like Octavius, or a text like Polycarp's Martyrdom, these kinds of texts would have been sort of circular texts that would have been distributed and passed around to the churches. Not unlike, the book of Revelation that was meant to
Yeah.
go to the churches, to be a motivating factor for those churches to get themselves right. But I don't know how, and I'm sure your guest that you're having on, I think this is something that we continue to talk about, how to be. I think some of it comes from discipleship, how to be so confident in our theological and moral convictions that we're willing to have conversations in ways that everyday people can have conversations about what is good and right and true, like these guys on an afternoon stroll.
Let's move it on here. You mentioned about some of the arguments for Christianity. I think you got several here to kind of get on a positive note here. Some of the things that they would see in Christianity about the uniqueness, the antiquity, the public good, and so forth.
Yeah.
Maybe just kind of comment that, see the contrast of the competing
Yeah.
pagans, the lifestyle, and the influence of salt and light.
Yeah. So you're talking about the next chapter, the public life, the next chapter on public life. But yeah, what happens? At the end of the section on intellectual life, yeah, I talk about the uniqueness of the church, and then talk about the church as a moral good. Yeah, there's a section. There's so much. There's so much here, but there's just as a example. There's Justin Martyr was an apologist in the second century, and he writes an apology. And early on, he sort of says, "Hey, if you want to see what flourishing looks like, look at our community." And he talks about those whose basically lives had been transformed. We who used to be involved in all kinds of depraved things are no longer. We who used to do these, we don't do those things anymore. And he just walks through and says, in other words, like, the proof is in the pudding. Like, look at what the church is doing. Look at lives being transformed. Look at lives being changed. Look at marriages. Look at the way in which husbands and wives relate to each other. There was an issue that was often brought up. And those were some of the apologetic arguments. Yeah, I call it sort of a moral apologetic, in the sense that we are your best citizens. We are your best people. And it is a challenge in the intellectual life. Not all the arguments were sort of your classical apologetic arguments. When you think about, the 5 reasons for God, and defense of the resurrection, the sort of classical apologetics, there's a healthy amount of their apologetics that were basically like, look at our lives. We are faithful. We provide. We are moral. We don't get involved in kinds of the depravity. And those who were used to be involved in all kinds of these things, their lives are transformed and changed. And it's a powerful apologetic. I talk about, there's a one story that's really interesting. I mentioned there was a pagan writer named Lucian who wrote something called a play called The Passing of Peregrinus. In the midst of this play, Peregrinus converts to Christianity. He ends up in prison, and then Lucian, a pagan, describes how Christians flock to help him. In other words, they came, they read scripture to him in prison, they provided for him. And Lucian, it's supposed to be funny. Lucian is mocking the Christians for their generosity and he says Peregrinus didn't actually become Christian. He just joined them to kind of make some money, almost like Simon the magician in Acts chapter 8. And so he's sort of mocking the Christians for them being sort of country bumpkin kind of people and laughing at them. But really, if I wanted to be part of a community, I want to be one that's going to visit me if I ended up in prison.
Sure.
I want to be around the kind of people that demonstrate the beauty of the gospel. And That was a powerful apologetic, I think, in the ancient world. I think it can be for us today. There's a complexity here because, to go back to that, the Christendom is dying, and we got to deal with, people who have been hurt by the church, or people who have been through all kinds of things related to the church, and even the kinds of churches you mentioned earlier. And that presents sort of a complexity, but I think there's a calling here to be the church, be the kind of theologically courageous and morally courageous people. And it was a powerful apologetic in the ancient world.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to let you close out here on the last chapter. I thought it was, we talked a little bit about, I believe, Blandina, but just the hope that the Christian had. A lot of the rulers and leaders couldn't wrap their mind around that.
Yeah, you saw it in that account of the resurrection. In my last chapter, I have the chapter on public life that kind of gets into some of the things more detail, what I just mentioned. And then I have a chapter on hope. And on hope, I talk about two things: the hope of the resurrection and the hope of the coming kingdom.
Yes.
And I talk about how those two things animate the life. They're like the thread that just ties together their arguments, because it is so hard to walk with the theological virtue of hope. But the one thing I walked away from that chapter when I was writing it, I just kept seeing again and again and again, in spite of everything, they truly believed Christ was going to come again in glory, judge the living and the dead, and establish a kingdom that was had. They held fast to 1 Corinthians 15. When at the opening of the book of Acts, when the disciples say, "Are you going to bring your kingdom now?" And our Lord says, "No, not yet. There's going to be some time." But just the whole book of Acts, you're living with this: when is the kingdom going to come? And I was inspired by seeing the way in which that vision of hope guided their everyday activities. It wasn't just about what's going to happen in the future. It was about, because that's going to happen, I can walk faithfully today, and I can be confident in every apologetic conversation, and every political conversation, and every pastoral context. I can walk in hope. And that chapter in particular was important for me, and really, really kind of guided some of my reason for writing the book.
Last question. What do you hope that people will take away from this, pastors, lay people, from the book?
I hope that they are, as you walk through the chapters, the big takeaways, I hope that they envision how to live a life of faith embedded in the world, that they draw from the stories, they draw from some of the discussions I have, and they figure out how to live that life embedded in the world, walking in hope, and recognizing that, hey, we have been here before. The church has been here before. It may look dark. Times may be changing, but God is in control. This is his world. We are the sheep of his pasture, and he is walking with us. The challenge before us is to be faithful.